So, in terms of technique, so an interview is a conversation with direction. Um, I know that sounds kind of weird. uh, Basically, what you're trying to do is steer the conversation in a particular way, but equally, you want to react to what the interviewee is saying. I mean, you don't necessarily know what they're going to say in advance, and you, as the interviewer, you must bear the listener in mind. That listener who you identified maybe earlier, or listeners, the intended audience, um, and that will allow you to ask questions on the listener's behalf. So, as I said, in on the machine, often if somebody uses a technical term or gets into some jargony things or discusses some concept that's maybe reasonably advanced, um, it, I might know what that is already. I might not know, but I might know what it is already. But I might ask what to for the person to explain it anyway. It's not for my benefit, it's for the listener's benefit. It's for Emma's benefit, Emma, the fake listener who we have on the machine. This concept is called informed naivety. It's where you ask questions that you already know the answer to, but you're asking on the listeners. And the best broadcasters and the best podcasters all do this. Now, the building blocks of all questions are mostly those W words: who, what, where, when, and how, a H one in there as well. So what you've got to think about is what those questions will provide. So who is asking for a fact? And the answer is usually a person or an organization. When? We're asking for a fact, a date or a time. Where? Again, another fact. It's probably a place. What? That is a fact or an interpretation of a fact. So we could get a wider answer there. And the same with how. We're looking for an interpretation or an explanation as to what happened. Which is used when there's maybe a range of options. And why, you're looking for an opinion as to why, or why the reason a course of action occurs. And this talks about question scope. And we have open questions and closed questions. So an open question has lots of variations, and it can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So how do you feel about something? To what extent do you think? Open questions are really good for stimulating conversation, because when you're asked an open question, you can go off on a tangent. A really good open question, and it's one that's often not asked, is why. So you ask somebody a question, how much did you pitch the product when you were first releasing the product? How much was it? And then they give you an answer. Oh, it was $99. Okay, why? Why was it $99? So the first question was closed, had a short answer. The second question, the follow-up question, why, gave them a lot of scope to explain what happened. So we've established the value, and now we're going to explore that value as to the reasons behind it. So that's a closed question. Closed questions usually have short answers. They're usually factual. There's another one as well, which often happens, is yes, no answers, which is did you or can you confirm, those type of things. So that's question width: open, closed, etc., etc. How much room for maneuver you're giving the interview. Sometimes questions can be too open. So, for example, you've just returned from a tour of Australia. Tell me about it. Now, first off, that's not really a question. That could be interpreted in any way. They might answer that and they might start telling me about a flight, or they might talk about the food that they had in Australia, or they might tell me about something else about Australia. Whereas maybe let's say this was a band and I was interviewing a band, I might want to know about how the gigs went. I should ask them about the gigs, not just a broad question like, tell me about it. So, much better off reducing the scope or reducing the width of the question. Another type of question that I try to avoid is the either or. This is where people ask a question, but you're closing things down as a go. So, did you introduce this new software feature because the market demanded it, or were you working on it anyway? The problem with that question is that I've introduced a huge amount of bias there, because I'm narrowing it down to two reasons why this new software feature might have been introduced. It might be one of these, it might be none of these, it could be something else. A much better question would be, why did you introduce this new software feature? Because that would allow the interviewee to explain things properly, rather than necessarily have to say, oh, the market didn't demand it, or we were working on it anyway. There could be a whole other reason for introducing this feature. There's a concept called devil's advocate, which is where the interviewee, or the interviewer will adopt a contrary role to the interviewee. And it can seem like somebody is at odds, or is arguing with the interviewee, but they may not necessarily have this position themselves. But the idea is they're asking on the listener's behalf. This is particularly true of, you'll hear a lot of current affairs broadcasters or news podcasters will do this. So it's essentially to take the role of the other side. I know that's a binary choice, and I don't really like that kind of language, but the idea of playing devil's advocate is to present counter arguments to what an interviewee might be talking about. This happens a lot, I said, on political interviews or current affairs type interviews. It might not necessarily be something that you want to do, but it is worth being aware of devil's advocate. Some people are really good at it. Matt Cooper, he's a radio presenter on Today FM. He also has got a very good podcast. He's very good at devil's advocate. He may not necessarily adhere to a position himself, but he will adopt that position for the sake of a mistake that novice interviewers often fall afoul of is asking loads of questions all at once. So there, for example, on the screen, why did the meeting break into disorder? How will you prevent it from happening in the future? Was there a disruptive element? There's actually 3 questions in that statement there. The person who's being interviewed might only actually remember the last one, and they may have forgotten what else was being said. So you're much better off asking short questions that are to the point, and try to avoid long rambling sentences. I'm very guilty of that at times, I have to admit. So leading questions are something that you have also to be aware of, because they also do introduce bias into the equation. So for example, why did you start a business on such shaky finance? So with a question like that, I'm saying that the finances were shaky, which is making a value judgment that may not necessarily be true. It also could get the interviewees, it could make them on edge. It could seem rude. A much better way to do it would be to ask a series of questions to lead up to that. So for example, how much money did you use to start your business? There's a fact, there's going to be a figure associated with that. At the time, did you regard this as enough? Yes or no? How do you view that now? And then what would you say to creditors such as Ecme Corp who regard this action as reckless? So instead of just having one big question, a series of shorter questions can lead the listener up to a particular value or a particular judgment that might be. And again, this is going to be in the interviewee's own words. So as we explore those short questions, we might learn more about the situation than just asking a blunt question like the first one on the page there. Question evasion is something that can happen when somebody doesn't want to answer a question that is asked. Now, politicians are very, very good at this. I don't have a huge amount of experience with this myself. So my experience with question evasion is usually when I'm talking to somebody and they don't know the answer to something that I asked, but they don't want to appear like they don't know. And in those cases, I don't push them because I'm not trying to show anyone up or make anyone feel bad. And the great thing about podcasts is that if you've asked a question that somebody doesn't know the answer to and they're really uncomfortable with it, because it's all pre-recorded, you can just edit it out later. Another thing you'd want to do is be very, very careful about asking deeply personal questions, particularly if they're outside of the scope of what the original interview was set up about. So if you were, like, let's say, for example, you've arranged to conduct an interview with a business person about their career in whatever field they're in. Asking them questions about their personal life could be out of bounds. It might not be relevant, especially because you've told them in advance that you want to talk about their business. So the question on the screen there about chemotherapy, if that came out of the blue, that would be wholly inappropriate. Like if you knew that this person had suffered from cancer, asking them about chemotherapy would be totally inappropriate. However, if you were talking to somebody about their business and they volunteered the information, they introduced the information that they had to step back for a while as they were undergoing cancer treatment, and they had a couple of small kids and they were worried about it, in that case, it would absolutely be okay to pull on that thread and ask them about it. Obviously, you'd want to be tactful and respectful, but they brought it up in the first place. So as long as you're sensitive and polite, I would see no reason why you couldn't pull on a thread that somebody else introduces. But if you know something personal about somebody that's beyond the scope of the interview, it's not your place to introduce it, because that could just come off as out of bounds. This is one that is a little bugbear of mine. This is where somebody doesn't ask a question, but instead makes a statement and expects the person to just react to that statement. It's a non-question. So for example there, your new album is oh look, I have a spelling mistake on the slides. Your new album is heavily influenced by Daft Punk. Go. That's a non-question. The person might say, it is, it isn't. They might respond with what they think of Daft Punk. They might sit there just waiting for me to ask them a question. They may say something else entirely. A much better way of asking that would be, how much is your album influenced by Daft Punk? That would be a much better question to ask, because it's quite wide. It allows them to go off on one, but equally I've asked them a direct question. There's another thing about interviewing, and it's about non-verbal communication. And this can play a significant role in an interview, particularly if an interview is going on for a while, like if it's going on for 30 minutes, if it's going on for 14 minutes, an hour. These are things like eye contact, smiling, cueing the person, or letting the person know that you're listening to them. That could be nodding your head. One I hear on podcasts a lot is people going, yeah, it's not just a cue to the interviewee to let them know that you're listening, but it's also a cue to the audience that you, the interviewer, are listening and you're still there. Now, you don't want to overdo things. You don't want to, to become annoying by you going, all the time. And it might be, if you're doing that all the time, it might be difficult for the listener to discern what the other person is saying. People who are really good at this are the hosts of the Daily Podcast from the New York Times. They will often chime in with, things like that. They're really good at it. If you haven't heard that podcast, it's well worth checking out. So this could be things like looking people in the eye if it's in person, nodding, just keeping that contact with them. One thing you should not do is start looking at your phone in the middle of an interview. It's poor manners. It's a red flag, because if I, as an interviewee, were listening to, or were being interviewed by somebody and they were sitting there with their head in their phone, to me that will come across as incredibly rude. It means they're not really valuing what I have to say. So I would go, well, what's the point of me answering your questions? You're not listening to me. So I don't think that's a good idea. So, if you have questions, put your questions on a piece of paper. A great thing about a piece of paper as well is you can have a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil. Pen and paper never run out of battery. They never go into sleep mode. They don't make noise. Like a phone beeping or a tablet beeping. So they're great things to have. So just watch out for that as well. And be polite, be respectful.